Alejandro Herrera, was used to receiving thousands of documents every day in his Madrid skyscrapers. As CEO of Herrera Steel, Spain's most powerful steel empire, he had built his $2 billion fortune by making ruthless decisions in seconds. But that Tuesday morning, when little Carmen, 5, showed up at his 50th floor office, clutching a letter in her tiny hands, Alejandro had no idea that those few lines, written in colored pencil, would destroy everything he believed in. The girl had disheveled blonde curls, her gray dress stained with tears, and she looked at him with those big eyes that seemed to contain all the pain in the world. Her words trembled as she asked him if she could read that very important letter. And when Alejandro read those innocent words, the heart of ice he had built over 40 years of business melted into a cry he hadn't felt since he was a child. Because sometimes you need the innocence of an angel to remind you what it means to be human. Alejandro Herrera woke up every morning at 5 o'clock in his 2,000 square meters penthouse in the heart of Madrid with a view of the entire urban skyline he had helped to build. At 45 years old, he had become the most feared and respected man in the world of Spanish steel. Herrera Steel controlled 70% of national production and had subsidiaries in 20 countries. His plants employed 100,000 people, but Alejandro never thought of them as human beings. They were numbers, variable costs to optimize. It had started from nothing. His father had died when he was 12, leaving the family ruined. Alexander had sworn that he would never again be poor, that he would dominate rather than be dominated. At 18, he started as a foundry worker, studying at night, saving every penny. At 25, he had his first small business. By 30, he controlled 3 plants. By 40, he had become an industrial giant. The price of success had been very high. I had never had time for love, for family, for friendships. The women who approached him were only interested in his money. The men surrounding him were either employees or rivals. Alexander lived in a golden ivory tower, surrounded by luxury, but completely alone. This November morning, like every morning for the past 20 years, Alejandro arrived at the office at 7:30. The Herrera skyscraper rose above Madrid with 50 floors of glass and steel, a symbol of power and modernity. His office occupied the entire top floor, 300 square meters of marble, hardwood, and cutting-edge technology. From the windows, he could see the entire city waking up, oblivious to the decisions he made every day, and that influenced the lives of thousands of people. That Tuesday, I had a particularly busy schedule. He had to decide on the closure of the Seville plant, which was too expensive and unproductive. 100 families would be left without work, but the numbers were clear. He also had to approve the new automation project that would lay off another 800 workers in 6 months. For Alejandro, they were just rational decisions, necessary to remain competitive. His assistant, Laura Jimenez, an efficient and discreet 40-year-old woman, brought him his 8 o'clock coffee and the day's agenda. 9 meetings, 14 international calls, 3 multi-million-dollar contracts signed. A typical day in the life of the most powerful man in Spanish steel. Alejandro didn't know that that morning he would receive a visit that would change his life forever. He didn't know that a 5-year-old girl with a card in her hand was about to teach him what it really meant to be rich. He didn't know that his icy heart was about to melt thanks to the purest words he had ever heard. As he reviewed production charts and calculated the quarter's profit margins, Alejandro Herrera remained convinced that money was the only thing that mattered in the world. In a few hours, he would discover how wrong he was. It was 10 a.m. when Alejandro heard an unusual commotion outside his office. Agitated voices, quick steps, someone protesting. Alejandro looked up from his papers, annoyed by the interruption. His day was planned down to the minute, and any unforeseen event irritated him deeply. The door to her office swung open and Laura walked in, her face worried, followed by 2 security guards who looked distressed. Behind them, hidden between the adult's legs, Alejandro glimpsed a small figure. Laura explained that the girl had managed to enter the building and insisted on seeing him. He had said that he had a very important letter to deliver to her personally. Alejandro got up from his desk irritated. How was it possible that a little girl had managed to overcome all the security systems of the most heavily armored skyscraper in Madrid? That's when he got a good look at her. Carmen was 5 years old, but she looked younger. She was small and thin, with blonde curls that looked like they hadn't been combed in days. She was wearing a gray dress that was too big for her, probably a donation, and worn shoes that had seen better days, but it was her eyes that were the most striking, large blue, and full of a determination I hadn't expected to see in such a small girl. Carmen stepped forward with uncertain steps, clutching a crumpled envelope to her chest. She didn't seem intimidated by the luxurious surroundings or by the presence of the tall, stern man in a dark suit everyone called Sir. He stopped in front of Alejandro's desk and looked up at him. When she asked if he was the important man who was in charge of everything, Alejandro looked at her in puzzlement. He had never spoken to a child in his life. He didn't know how to behave, what to say. The only thing he could think of was to get her out as soon as possible. Carmen did not answer his questions about how she had gotten in. Instead, he raised the envelope in his hand. I had a very important letter to give him, he explained in a breaking voice. His mother had given it to him before leaving. His voice trembled and his eyes filled with tears. Alejandro noticed that Carmen's little hands were shaking as she held the letter. The girl said that her mother had told her that he was the most important man in the city. He had told her that if anything happened to him, she should take that letter to him. It was very important, he insisted with effort, asking her to please read it. Alejandro looked at the crumpled envelope. It was addressed to him in elegant, feminine handwriting. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but something about the way Carmen looked at him made him doubt. There was a mature desperation in those girlish eyes, as if she had already seen too much pain for her age. When Laura suggested calling social services, Alejandro suddenly stopped her, surprising himself. He ordered everyone to wait outside. He was left alone with Carmen, who continued to stare at him with those immense eyes. Carmen introduced herself as Carmen Vasquez, 5.5 years old. When Alejandro asked about her mother, the girl looked down, in pain. His mother had gone to heaven the night before. The doctors had said they could no longer cure her. Before leaving, he had given her that letter and told her to take it to the most important man in Madrid, who would help her. Alejandro felt something tighten in his chest. That little girl had lost her mother a few hours earlier, and instead of crying in a corner, she had come to him with a letter. What incredible courage for such a small creature. He took the envelope from Carmen's little hands and opened it slowly. What he read shocked him more than any contract he had ever signed. The letter was written in elegant, but shaky handwriting. Alejandro began to read, and as he read, he felt the world crumble around him. Maria Vasquez presented herself as a worker at her Barcelona plant from 15 years ago. I worked at night so I could take care of Carmen during the day. One night, he had saved her life when a machine was about to explode. Everyone had fled, but Maria was trapped. Alejandro had entered the danger zone, risking everything to get her to safety. Now Maria Vasquez, 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, remembered. He had saved her by acting on instinct, and since that accident he had implemented revolutionary safety systems in all plants. The letter revealed that without that gesture Carmen would never have been born. Maria had raised her daughter, telling her about the brave man who had saved her mother. Carmen knew Alejandro was her hero, even though she had never met him. Alejandro looked up at Carmen. Now I understood that look of absolute confidence. She saw him as her mother's savior, the family hero. Maria confessed to being dying from a tumor discovered too late. He had no relatives and no money. The only thing he could give Carmen was the certainty that the man who had saved her mother would not abandon her. She wasn't asking me to adopt her, just not to leave her alone, to find her a family, a school, a future. I knew that beneath the businessman's armor there was still a good heart. Alejandro finished reading with moist eyes. Carmen waited silently, and he saw Maria's delicate features in her. When asked if her mother had told her about that night, Carmen nodded solemnly. He had told her he was the kindest man in the world, that he would take care of her. Alejandro felt his heart break. How could I disappoint the trust of those pure eyes? As he looked at Carmen, he realized that Maria was right. Beneath the armor was still the man who had risked his life for a stranger. And that girl was the result of that gesture. I couldn't abandon her. He knelt down to be at her level and confirmed that it was true. He would take care of her. And for the first time in 15 years, Alejandro Herrera cried. The days that followed were the most surreal of Alejandro's life. He had called the best lawyer in Madrid to process the legal paperwork. He had arranged a proper funeral for Maria, and most importantly, had brought Carmen home, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of caring for a 5-year-old girl. Her 1,000 square meters villa in Pozuelo, always immaculate and quiet, was transformed in just a few days. Alejandro had a room prepared for Carmen with everything he thought she might need. A canopy bed, a desk, closets full of new clothes, expensive toys that I didn't even know how to use. But Carmen seemed lost in all that luxury. The first night, when Alejandro put her to bed in her princely room, Carmen began to cry. They were not tears of sadness, but of bewilderment. She was used to sleeping in the little bed next to her mother, in a small, cozy room. That huge room made her feel even more alone. Alejandro sat on the edge of the bed, not knowing what to do. He had never comforted anyone in his life. When she asked what was wrong, Carmen explained in a small voice that the room was too big and didn't have mom smell. Alejandro felt his heart sink. I had thought that money could solve everything, but it couldn't by the comfort of a dead mother. With an uncertain gesture, he took Carmen in his arms and carried her to his room, making her sleep in the double bed next to him. For the first time in 40 years, Alejandro didn't sleep alone. The following days were a revolution. Alejandro had hired a housekeeper, but Carmen always wanted to be with him. She followed him around the house, asking 1,000 questions. He wanted me to explain everything I did. Alejandro discovered that he had to completely reorganize his life. I could no longer work 14 hours a day. Carmen needed to eat at regular times, to be escorted to the school Alejandro had chosen for her, and to have someone to listen to her when she recounted her day. For the first time in 20 years, Alejandro started leaving the office at 6 a.m. to be home for dinner. His collaborators were shocked. Alejandro Herrera, are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The man who had never canceled a meeting, not even because of the flu, was now interrupting important meetings because Carmen called him to tell him she had learned a new song at school. But the biggest change happened when Carmen started asking him questions about his work. With the innocent curiosity of children, I wanted to know what Alejandro was doing. He began to explain to her, in simple words, that he produced steel to build houses, bridges, cars. One night, while having dinner together, Carmen asked if the people who worked for him were happy. Alejandro hesitated. He had never thought about the happiness of his employees. When he replied that he thought so because it gave them work, Carmen replied with childlike logic that if the factory in Seville closed, those people would no longer be happy. Alejandro looked at her in astonishment. How did a 5-year-old girl know about the plant's closure? Then he remembered that he often talked on the work phone while Carmen played nearby. When she explained that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made in business, Carmen made a comparison that struck a chord. He asked if it was like when his mom had decided not to take any more medicine because it hurt too much. Alejandro was speechless. The girl had just compared her business decision to Maria's choice to skip chemotherapy to spend her final months with Carmen instead of suffering needlessly in the hospital. It had been a decision of love. When he said he was different, Carmen simply asked why. Alejandro could not answer. How could I explain to a little girl that closing a plant to increase profits was different from the decision of a sick mother? How could he justify that the happiness of 100 families was worth less than his profit margin? That night, while Carmen slept next to him, hugging the teddy bear that had belonged to her mother, Alejandro lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in 20 years, he was wondering if his decisions were right. For the first time, I saw the numbers on the balance sheets as real people, with families, hopes, fears. A 5-year-old girl was achieving what no competitor, no journalist, no trade unionist had ever achieved, was making Alejandro Herrera reflect on the human impact of his decisions. 3 months after Carmen's arrival, Alejandro's life had changed completely, not only in his daily routines, but also in his very way of seeing the world. The girl had brought into her life something she didn't know she had lost: the ability to wonder, to laugh, to feel tenderness. Carmen had adapted to her new life with the incredible resilience of children. She had started calling him Papa Alejandro, and after the initial pregnancy, he had discovered that he loved that title more than all the ones he had achieved in the business world. The girl went to the most exclusive school in Madrid. She had beautiful clothes, toys she never would have dreamed of, but most of all she had someone who loved her unconditionally. Alejandro had discovered that he had a calling for fatherhood. Every night he read stories to Carmen. I helped her with her first drawings and first letters. He comforted her when she had nightmares thinking about Mom. I had learned to make hot chocolate the way she liked it, to braid her hair for school, to sing lullabies I didn't even know I knew. But the most profound transformation concerned his approach to work. The decision to close the Seville plant was still on his desk, but Alejandro couldn't get his signature on it. Every time he picked up the pen, he saw Carmen's face asking him if those people would be happy. One morning, during a meeting of the board of directors, something happened that marked a definitive turning point. Its executives were presenting a restructuring plan that called for 15 layoffs across Spain. The numbers were impeccable: 20% profit increase in 2 years. Alejandro looked at the colorful graphs on the screen, the numbers dancing happily, showing growing profits. But behind each number he now saw a face, a family, a story. I saw the face of Maria Vasquez, who worked at night to raise Carmen. He saw workers returning home with their girls, just as he returned with Carmen. When he asked about the families of the 15 employees, the council looked at him in surprise. Alejandro Herrera had never asked questions like that. The personnel director responded that they would receive the compensation provided by law, and that other companies would take them over. When Alejandro insisted on asking what would happen if it didn't happen, he was told it wasn't his responsibility. Alejandro stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at Madrid stretching out below him, thinking of all the families who lived in those buildings, all the children like Carmen who waited for their parents at home at night. When he announced that the plan was rejected, there was absolute silence in the room. The managers looked at each other in disbelief. Alejandro explained that he wanted alternatives that did not involve staff cuts. They had to improve efficiency in other ways. Invest in technology that will increase productivity without eliminating jobs, find new markets, innovate. When it was pointed out to him that this required huge investments with no guaranteed results, Alejandro smiled serenely for the first time in years. I had learned from a 5-year-old girl that not all decisions are made by looking only at numbers. Sometimes you have to look at your heart. That afternoon, when Alejandro returned home, he found Carmen waiting for him with a drawing. He had drawn him and her holding hands in front of a large gray building. When asked what it was, Carmen explained that it was her factory, and those colorful figures around the building were all the happy people who worked for him. Alejandro took Carmen in his arms and hugged her tightly. That girl had seen in him the man he had always been able to be, but had chosen not to become. He had seen her heart beneath the shell of ice. He told her that the next day they would go to visit one of his factories. I wanted him to meet the people who worked there. Carmen clapped happily, asking if he could tell them that his boss was the best dad in the world. Alejandro laughed and realized he hadn't laughed like that from the heart since he was a child. That night, while Carmen slept next to him, Alejandro looked at the drawing he had hung above the nightstand. A little girl had drawn her version of happiness, not profit or power, but people smiling. And for the first time in 40 years, Alejandro understood that this was true wealth. A year after Carmen's arrival, Alejandro Herrera had become a completely different man. Herrera Steel was still Spain's most powerful steel empire, but now it was also the company with the happiest employees. Alejandro had invested billions in corporate wellness programs, company daycare centers, scholarships for employee children, and above all, he had established direct dialogue with all workers. Carmen, now 6.5 years old, had grown up surrounded by Alejandro's love and the affection of all the company's employees, who considered her their little princess. Every time she visited the plants with Dad Alejandro, the workers proudly showed her their work, and she thanked them with smiles and hugs that brightened her entire day. But the biggest change in Alejandro's life had come 6 months earlier, when he met Elena Ruiz, Carmen's new pediatrician. She was a 35-year-old woman, also a widow, who had dedicated her life to caring for children after losing her son in an accident. Elena had seen in Alejandro not the powerful industrialist, but the loving father who took Carmen to visits with a tenderness that touched the heart. Theirs had been a slow and deep love story built on family scenes. Afternoons reading stories to Carmen, weekends in the park where Alejandro had learned to push the swing and play hide and seek. Elena had brought into their lives a maternal sweetness that Carmen had lost, and Alejandro had finally found a woman who loved him for the man he had become, not for what he possessed. The wedding took place in the spring in the villa's garden, with a simple but emotional ceremony. Carmen acted as bridesmaid, proud of her pink dress and her important role. When the priest asked if Alejandro was taking Elena as his wife, Carmen intervened by asking if Elena was also taking her as her daughter. Everyone laughed through their tears, and Elena knelt down to hug Carmen, assuring her that she would be the mother her real mother in heaven had chosen for her. Alejandro looked at the scene with his heart bursting with joy. The girl who had come into his life with a letter had brought with her not only love, but had given birth to a true family, united not by blood, but by sincere affection. During the party, Alejandro stood up to give a speech that moved all the guests. He told the story of that morning a year earlier, when a brave little girl had shown up at his office with a letter. He told how Carmen had transformed his life, teaching him that true wealth is not measured in billions, but in smiles, hugs, and tears of joy. Looking at Carmen, who was listening to him attentively, he told her that she had saved him. Just as he had saved his mother 15 years ago, she had saved his soul. He had taught him that being powerful means protecting those who are weaker, that being rich means sharing happiness, that being a man means knowing how to cry with joy. Carmen got up from her chair and ran to hug him. When he asked if his mother in heaven was happy, Alejandro took her in his arms and looked up at the blue sky of that perfect day. He assured them that Mama Maria was very happy, that she was looking at them and smiling. 2 years later, Carmen had a little brother, Diego, whom Elena and Alejandro received as a precious gift. Carmen was the most loving older sister in the world, teaching Diego the songs his mother had taught him and telling him the story of the brave man who had saved Grandma Maria. Alejandro watched his family gather in the living room in the evenings, with Carmen reading a story to Diego while Elena boarded, and realized how blind he had been before. He had spent 40 years building a steel empire, but the real construction had begun when a little girl had taught him how to build a family. Herrera Steel continued to thrive, but now every decision was made not just with profits in mind, but with people in mind. Alejandro had created a business model that was an example throughout Europe. You could be competitive and human at the same time. You could make money and make employees happy. One night, while putting Carmen to bed, the girl asked him a question that touched his heart. If when she grew up, she too could help people like he did. Alejandro kissed her on the forehead, explaining that she was already helping him become a better man every day. When she grew up, she could do anything she wanted, and he would always be proud of her. When Carmen asked if he would be proud, even if she didn't become rich like him, Alejandro smiled. He explained that she had taught him what it meant to be truly rich, and that she was already the richest person he knew. That night, as he watched Carmen sleep peacefully in her bed, Alejandro thought about the letter from Maria that he still kept in his desk drawer. That brave mother had seen well. He really had a good heart under the armor of a businessman. I had just forgotten to use it. Carmen had reminded him. And now Alejandro Herrera. He was finally the man he had always been able to be, a father, a husband, a leader who led with his heart as well as his mind. Because sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to remind adults what it truly means to live. And sometimes a letter written with love can change the world more than any million-dollar contract. Like it. If you believe the love of a child can change any heart, please share what moment in the story touched you the most. Share to inspire those who still believe in the power of the family of the heart. Subscribe for more stories of second chances and familial love. Sometimes a letter is worth more than $1 million contract. Sometimes a child sees the heart that adults have forgotten to have. And sometimes the most beautiful family is born from a promise kept. Because true wealth is measured in hugs, not balance sheet. Oh,